Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Connecting the Dots, Empowering Campuses to Create Change. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. My name is Abigail Boyer, Assistant Executive Director of Programs for the Clery Center for Security on Campus. Myself and our Program Manager, Amy Guthrie, will moderate today's webinar. She's going to start out by reviewing a few housekeeping items before we get started, but first we'd be remiss not to acknowledge the significance of this date, being that it is September 11th. So we hope that all of you on the call are able to take the time to pause and reflect and practice some self-care, and we certainly encourage you to do the same throughout this webinar. With that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you. You'll notice that there is a questions pane on your control panel, and we definitely encourage you to interact with us by typing in questions and comments there throughout the webinar. We will dedicate the last 15 minutes to address these. We will also use the questions pane to communicate relevant information and links to resources that are mentioned. If you are using social media throughout the event, please use the NACSAM 2014 hashtag. We've also enjoyed a lot of the conversations and information that people have been sharing thus far for September, so keep it up. We are also recording the session today, so you'll receive a link to the recording within 48 hours, or you can visit the Clery Center on YouTube page where we'll have all of the NACSAM webinar recordings. Finally, we will be conducting a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we would very much appreciate any thoughts and suggestions that you can provide so that we can continue to provide you with useful information and resources going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the folks who have participated in a lot of the other webinars that we've had this month, and for all of the information that you've given us in the evaluations. It's really going to help inform the work that we do. We also want to thank Campus Answers, which is a new division of Workplace Answers, for sponsoring this webinar and helping us bring together really an incredible group of panelists for today's discussion on how community members and higher education leaders can play a role in creating a positive culture on campus. Just to give you a sense of what to expect during this webinar, we'll start with our panelist discussion and then leave time at the end for questions and answers. Please feel free, as Amy mentioned, to use that questions pane to share your questions and comments throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as possible during that last 15 minutes. We are so thrilled that today's panelists were able to join us today, and I'll just share a little bit about each of them before we get started. Dr. Brooke DeCipio has her PhD in Human Sexuality from Widener University. She is the Director of Gender Violence Education and Support at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and teaches classes in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department on college hookup culture and the sexuality of college students. Her cutting-edge research focuses on primary gender violence prevention for collegiate males. Brooke has spoken at and consulted for other colleges and universities, businesses, and the federal government. Brooke helps institutions create a strengths-based, positive approach to gender violence prevention, design a comprehensive, highly visible campus-wide gender violence prevention strategy, comply with federal legislation, and build strong relationships with community partners. Dr. Jocelyn Gant is the Assistant to the President for Social Equity and the Associate Vice President for International Programs at Clarion University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gant's professional work has focused on the management of institutional diversity, conflict resolution, and international education. Her leadership and diversity best practices has been recognized by the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and several national publications during the American Council on Higher Education's publications on diversity. Dr. Gant holds a doctorate degree in higher educational administration and policy from Boston College, with concentrations in higher education and the law and comparative higher education systems, a master's and bachelor's degree in English from Boston College and the University of Massachusetts, respectively. Dr. Gant has held faculty appointments at several public and private institutions of higher education. And last but not least, Dr. Lisa McBride, a St. Louis native, has an extensive and distinguished background. Currently, she serves as the inaugural Chief Diversity Officer at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, PCOM, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Since her tenure at PCOM, Dr. McBride has implemented the President's Diversity Council, PCOM, created and developed the Cultural Competency Training and Curriculum, developed a diversity leadership series, and collaborated with PCOM students, PsyDs, DOs, and clinicians to partner with Project Home, an initiative targeting homeless veterans, to provide health care in Philadelphia. She previously served as Special Assistant to the President for Equity, Justice, and Diversity and University Ombudsperson, at the California University of Pennsylvania, CalU. Prior to her role at CalU, Dr. McBride held several positions in the Florida State University system, including the Assistant Director of the Policy Institute of Conflict, Oppression, and Terrorism Studies, Institutional Diversity Coordinator, and Associate Professor in the Criminal Justice Department. Dr. McBride began her career as a police officer in St. Louis, Missouri, and she then transitioned to a federal criminal investigator for 8 years in various international countries as an undercover operative and demonstrates competency working with people of diverse ethnicities and background. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll get started. So our first question is, we know that getting buy-in to develop programs and policies is key. So how can campus administrators effectively support staff who are on the front lines of doing this type of work, and how can you get that buy-in? So Brooke, we're going to start with you. How can you get buy-in and support around some of these issues?
Hi, everyone. So 2 recommendations that I can make in terms of getting buy-in.
Brooke, I think we may be having a little bit of trouble with your audio. So if you just want to double check that one really quickly.
Can you all hear me?
And in the meantime, while she's working with that, Lisa, one of the things that we've talked about in some of our conversations is how to build relationships on your campus and how to really work with some other folks on campus who might be interested in really changing the culture. So what do you think that should look like?
As it relates to the getting buy-in, it's very important for the individuals to understand that you first have to start with your presidents and your board of trustee members. It has to.
Let me apologize as we're having some audio issues on our end.
Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you, Lisa. Do you want to go ahead?
Oh, yes. I was saying that I hope everyone can now hear me, but I was saying that it is very important for the participants to understand that you have to get the buy-in from the president and the board of trustees first. It's oftentimes believed that Title IX compliance is something that everyone understands, and so it's very important to first engage those groups at the top. And recently, the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, AGB, actually developed some statement or advisory statement and guidance to boards and how they should become better informed on Title IX compliance, Clery, etc. And I would highly recommend that to begin the conversation, that one looks at that document for their board of trustee members at their institutions and also for the president.
Okay, so taking a closer look at kind of how you build those relationships, especially with the board of trustees and the president. We're looking at some of the feedback from the group, and it sounds like some of you could hear Brooke, and unfortunately with some of the technical difficulties we were having on our end, we couldn't hear her. Brooke, do you want to see if you can add a little bit to that conversation? See if we can hear you on our end?
Can you all hear me now?
I can. Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Hi again, everyone. So again, 2 suggestions or recommendations that I can offer are, number 1 is to approach it as an ally. So it's important to get the buy-in from senior leadership, but also from other faculty and staff members who you'll need to partner and collaborate with, but also students and the larger campus community. And so again, the first way is to approach it as an ally. And so we often tend to reach out and, I'm here to do a gender violence prevention program, which lots of people automatically, their walls and barriers go up. And so if we approach it from the standpoint of you're doing really great work around fill in the blank, so leadership work, emotional intelligence, self-esteem and confidence. So you're doing great work in these areas. How can I help you to connect those things to prevention work around gender violence as well? So I am your colleague, your ally, and how can we build on the great work that you are already doing and now apply it to the gender violence prevention piece? And then the second recommendation is having your rationale. So oftentimes senior leadership, but also supervisors, or again, if you're going out to get buy-in from campus partners, you know, why? Like, why are we needing to do this program or initiative, or why this policy or procedure change? And so if you're able to provide for them that rationale, so here are some national mandates. Here are some research studies that shows that this is a effective program. So having those pieces in place and a well thought out proposal will help with that buy-in piece. So again, it's much easier for people to sign on to projects and initiatives, especially if they're controversial. With, again, the gender violence piece, often we're talking about sex and relationships, which can be controversial. And so if you have those rationale pieces that you can provide, it will be much easier to get people on board.
Right. I think that's a really great point, and also speaks to a little bit of what Lisa was just saying in getting the buy-in with those relationships. Lisa, you mentioned the title of a document that you thought would help with getting buy-in from board of directors, so almost having some of those additional tools to make your case. Would you mind repeating what the name of that document was? Because we had a couple of people ask for what that was.
Okay, yes, it's the Association of Governing Boards Statement on Sexual Misconduct, and it was developed with the assistance of the National Association of Colleges and University Attorneys, and they can actually find it at www.agb.org.
Great, and we can start looking for that as well, so that we can plug that into the chat box and send it to you, and we can also include it in the follow-up email so that you're able to access not just the recording of this webinar, but some of those additional tools. I think, you know, Brooke and Lisa, you both made really great points about starting the conversation, and I loved what you said, Brooke, about really approaching it as an ally and assuming that people, you know, the people that you're approaching are already doing great work or want to do great work, and starting from that lens. And so after you build some of those relationships, you know, you've made your argument, you made your case, you're really kind of taking that team approach, it would also make sense to think about how you might even formalize some of these processes. So, Jocelyn, how did your campus go about doing that?
Yes, as it relates to Clarion, first let me state that in order to promote a campus of culture, a campus culture of trust and safety, Clarion has made a conscious decision to focus its efforts and resources primarily on prevention. And to that end, we are crafting a very comprehensive plan that is consistent with our university educational values, and one that engages all of the principal stakeholders, and I think this is key, including university legal counsel, student, faculty, and staff, law enforcement, women's and other presidential commissions, and also external community resources such as crisis intervention counselors. As such, what I've found is that this team approach allows for consistent messaging while minimizing the potential for silos.
And I think consistent messaging is something that we hear quite a bit at our organization. You know, how do we make sure we're all on the same page? And that's a really excellent point as well. As I was really looking at how does some of this work align with some of your values as an institution, because certainly building a culture of respect on campus, really addressing issues around things like sexual violence, dating violence, domestic violence, stalking, certainly all of those things are in line with the values of your institution. So really building on that to create and to develop buy-in, and then create a formalized process for how all of these different departments will work together. Brooke, I know that your campus had an interesting approach to how you kind of formalize these relationships and what role your particular role would be. So would you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Sure. So Lehigh took the approach of developing a gender violence education and support office, which I direct. And so having that one person or one office on campus that can serve as the clearinghouse for the gender violence prevention efforts has been really successful. So again, like I said earlier, there are lots of other spaces on campus and in the community who are doing this work already, so bringing speakers, doing programming, and so having an office that can reach out and liaison to all of those people and then connect them has been really successful. The other thing too, just to mention, in terms of the formalizing piece, definitely wanting to make sure that you're putting things in writing. So one of the things that we have struggled with in the last couple years is you have an amazing person or an amazing group of students who comes in and is developing programs or, you know, cutting edge policies and procedures, and when that person leaves, that momentum can leave with them. And so making sure that all of your policies and procedures and programs and things are in writing somewhere, so that no matter who is in that role, there are the steps in place. So a good example that I can think of is my office and the police department on campus have a great working relationship. And you know, if I were, or the chief of police were to leave, right, we then have something in writing so that those positions are continuing to collaborate and work closely together. So making sure that you are really formalizing by putting things in writing so that no matter who is in the position, that collaboration and those policies and procedures are continuing to happen.
Great. So it seems like some of the themes is kind of knowing who's doing this type of work on your campus or who might be involved in this process, and then also really figuring out for the folks that are doing this work, is this a part of their job description? Is this something that we've truly institutionalized as opposed to something that may be an interest in something that one individual has explored, but that could potentially not carry over if someone else with a different personality or agenda might have within that particular position. So if you look at the slide in front of you, there's a couple of kind of high-level takeaways that we pulled from some of these suggestions. So the first is to approach it as an ally and to really think about building relationships on your campus. And you've probably heard this from our organization before, but we really like to start from a place of strengths. So start by thinking about what do we do well, what kind of people do we have at the table that might really be able to help with that, and then build upon that. Make the case. So have in your back pocket, whether that's statistics on nationally, some of the things that people are seeing, whether that's evaluation that you've done on your own campus as to why it's so important, whether that's documents like the one that Lisa mentioned that was shared with you in the chat function, so that you have that for yourself to use as well. So starting to think about how do we make the case for why, you know why this is important, but how do we make sure that other folks on campus know why it's important, not just from a place of passion and care, which we know that you all have, but also from a place of evaluation and knowledge of the issues and why all of this information and these practices are so important. Evaluate existing knowledge. So that was something that I thought was really thoughtful about what Lisa was saying, is that a lot of times we need to have a sense of what people know going in. Many times we may make the assumption that certain people are aware of the existing laws or the requirements or what we need to do as an institution, and sometimes that may not be the case. There might be new ways to educate them. First, know what they're aware of, and then also educate them on certain issues. Starting the dialogue, so reaching out and trying to figure out who else could be at the table, especially recently with some of the changes to the Clery Act. This is something that we've seen as an organization, in which a lot of people see changes to the law and they automatically assume, well, all of this has to fall on me, when in reality there might be a lot of other people on your campus that are doing a lot of really important work that could contribute to that and meet some of those different elements. So starting the conversation, making a comprehensive plan, putting some of these elements in writing, making it a part of their job description, as Brooke was just saying. And then for her campus, she found that it was a good fit to make a clearinghouse to make connections. So she's in a role where she can identify what all of these different strengths are and be able to connect people to those resources, and also be able to connect internally as well, so that each of the different departments have a sense of what's going on and who's at the table. And that kind of brings us to the next area, which is really who should be at that table when developing policy. So how do students and other community members play a role in putting that together? So Lisa, I'd love to start with you. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that, first of all, Title IX compliance is everyone's job, and I think that's the message that you have to send to members of your community. It's due diligence is required of all the faculty, staff, and everyone that is a part of the community and an extension of the community. And so I would recommend that you take a systems approach and I had the advantage of being in the Pennsylvania state system, which has many universities within it, where there was this assertive effort for all of the schools to have a Title IX coordinator, to have legal counsel, and to have similar policies. But when I came to PCOM, it was much different. There was no existing policy, so I had to start from the ground up. And when I say systems approach and just making sure that it's very important that you get the key Title IX compliance operatives, meaning you need the counseling staff, security, police, student affairs, resident life, victims advocates, healthcare staff, assess whether or not you have a threat assessment team, which I think is very important when you're talking about responding to these types of incidents, and also making sure that your language is student friendly. Do focus groups to ascertain from students how would they like to be described in policies. And oftentimes you hear people using complainant, respondent, victim, and so I would suggest that you do focus groups and engage students in these efforts as well, and engage particularly men on your campus so that you can be more in the prevention mode.
Right, so kind of engaging all of those different areas. And it's so interesting, you know, how you talk about this working group related to Title IX, because that's something that we would really echo with Clery as well. Even though it's not the key focus of this webinar, we're looking comprehensively at all of these different areas. But it's something that we have seen in the work that we've done, is that sometimes you'll see that teamwork and that collaboration and that process with Title IX, but we're not seeing it as often with Clery. I think as an organization we're seeing it more and more, especially with some of the changes. But that's something to think about as well. If you have an existing working group that's working really well around Title IX, how would some of these individuals play a role with Clery? Because we know that that has to be a collaborative effort as well. And even beyond that, are there other systems? We certainly don't want to meet just to meet or have a group just to have a group, but there are a lot of areas where people can really intentionally provide a lot of value and insight and thoughtfulness to the process. So that's something that I would echo there, but absolutely, really, you mentioned focus groups, so really putting a finger to the pulse of your institution and what they would like to see, and what are some things that you should think about and reflect within your policies. Brooke, I know that Lehigh has a gender violence working group, so would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Sure. So we have two groups actually. So the larger group is the Gender Violence Reporting Group, and so that is comprised of numerous key stakeholders on campus. So Student Conduct Office, our Police Department, our General Counsel's Office, our Prevention Strategies and Health Advancement Office, Student Affairs, Dean of Students members, Women's Center, Risk Management, and so that's a larger group that developed out of a steering committee who met at this time, probably about 7 to 10 years ago, to come up with a long-term strategic plan around gender violence. And so that group continues to meet about once or twice a semester, depending on kind of the needs and where we're at with policy and procedure review. And then a subset of that group is our Gender Violence Working Group. And so that's a smaller core of the larger reporting group. So it's made up of myself, so Director of Gender Violence Education and Support, members from the General Counsel Office, a dean, so an Associate Dean of Students, and then the Chief of Police, of University Police. And so our smaller working group meets pretty regularly, so at least once a month, sometimes more like twice or 3 times a month, depending on kind of the new recommendations that are coming out, or any type of cases that we have going on our particular campus. But so that small working group is really kind of the backbone of policy and procedure change on campus. So we meet, we constantly are reviewing policy and procedure to make sure that we are continuing to do best practice. From there, we pitch the recommendations to the larger gender balance reporting group, and then from there we share out with senior leadership. But so that really is the core group that does most of the back work in terms of getting policies and procedures changed. And I'll just add too, so great points by Lisa, and I think too, just to reiterate, is it isn't just those key stakeholders on campus, but it really is a community effort. So as educational institutions, we cannot perform all of the needs that survivors have. And so having good working relationships with your local rape crisis center, with your local hospitals that can perform the forensics evidence exams, reaching out to places like the Clery Center for Security on campus. So having those broader community connections are really important and key to make sure that we are meeting all of the needs of survivors. And then also echoing Lisa's point about the engagement of students. So as administrators and faculty and staff members, we can come up with great policies and procedures around gender violence, but we are not a second-year female student out on a Tuesday night at XYZ party. And so having the students' voice in these conversations and their lived experience is key to being effective.
I love that on how to kind of bring them all together. And I just wanted to introduce or add to one of the comments that a participant shared. Is she said, as a SART coordinator, so a sexual assault response coordinator, we found that all voices, survivors, Title IX, even the arts teacher, will add vital input. And I think that that really echoes what you were just saying, Brooke, is that we need to make sure that we're not kind of creating these policies in silos without an understanding of our campus culture and all of those different individuals and voices that play a role. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be involved in every stage, so they're not all going to be necessarily a part of that working committee, but there are different ways, like the focus groups that were mentioned a little bit earlier, there are different ways to engage, you know, students and faculty and staff and other members of the community to make sure that you're really taking that more comprehensive look at how these are developed. Jocelyn, what does the process look like on your campus, and how do you really ensure that you're drafting balanced policies that are also trauma-informed, because we know that that's key?
Yes, to ensure that your policies are well balanced and are trauma-informed, I would make or offer the following recommendations. One, that your policies set forth very clear and fair standards, including compassion for the victims and due process for the accused. Secondly, that they're thoroughly vetted by all campus constituencies and governing boards prior to approval. Third, they are informed by best and promising practices. 4, they require all disciplinary proceedings to be administered by trained personnel with the appropriate expertise. And last but not least, that they're supported by ongoing face-to-face or online training. At Clarion, for example, our training is offered by, our online training is offered by Workplace Answers, and I would certainly support what Brooke said about reaching out to the National Center for Public Safety, and I think that's located in Vermont. And the CDC, that offers some very good guidance as well on sexual violence. So those are some very good resources to inform your policies.
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent point to really just start thinking about, you know, one of the elements that you brought up is training for campus professionals and really figuring out, we've had quite a few phone calls recently from individuals trying to figure out what system or what structure is best for them. And the answer that we always give is you always need to look for what's best for your own particular campus and your own particular culture. So rather than making this decision quickly because you feel like you need to implement something, really having a thoughtful process for what is best for us and what does that look like and who might we partner with to make that happen. One of the things that Brooke mentioned was partnering with county victim service organizations, and that's something that we always encourage because we found that a lot of times with some of these additional elements, these additional requirements, like we said, there are people who are already doing the work who might be able to add a really valuable voice and really assist you with some of these processes. So regardless of what that looks like for your campus, because really what is the best fit is going to vary from institution to institution, making sure that you're asking the right questions and bringing the right people to the table. And we're actually going to have another webinar right in the beginning of October, October 2nd, that will be focused a little bit more specifically in that area of what are some of the questions that we should think about to make sure that all the different types of education and training we're implementing are really effective for our campus in particular. Brooke, I know that one thing, kind of relating back to some of the things that we've been talking about, one of the things that you've mentioned is that your campus debriefs after every case. So would you mind sharing a little bit about what that means for your campus, for Lehigh?
Yeah, so again, we can have the best policies and procedures in place, but every case is different. So every survivor's experience is different. And so making sure that we have the key people at the table after every case just to talk about what worked, what didn't work, and, you know, is there any updates or changes that we need to make at that point? So again, referring back to some of the previous comments about, you know, from a trauma-centered perspective, you know, was our process working? So, you know, we sit down at a table and we create these things, but then when it is actually used in practice, needing to make sure that you're then having the conversation of did it go as planned, or was it meeting the goal that we set out at the beginning? So a good example is, you know, if you're updating your student conduct procedures around some of the new recommendations, after you have a case actually go through the procedure, sitting down and talking about did it work the way that we hoped it would? If it did, great. If not, what can we tweak or what can we change moving forward? And that's also a really great time, again, to have those multiple voices and perspectives informing your policies and procedures. So we talk a lot about at Lehigh how the way that a police officer finds a case successful is very different than the way that my office as a survivor support resource would. And so recognizing that their role and what they need to get out of gender violence incidents is very different than what mine might be, and that's okay. But so something may have worked from a legal perspective for them, but it didn't work from a survivor supportive perspective on my end. And so again, recognizing that we have different roles and then how can we adjust or change as needed to try and make sure that we're meeting everyone and the work that they're trying to do.
Great. So it's really it sounds like it's really going beyond checking the box. You know, it's beyond saying, you know, we have a policy in place, but it's continually revisiting, is this structure, is this process, is this policy working for all of the individuals on our particular campus? And I think that's critical to recognize that everyone does have a different role and a different perspective, and all of those different perspectives are going to add value to the conversation, but we need to be able to get all of those folks to the table. I know that there were some questions that came in about that, so we're going to get to some of the great questions that you have coming in right at the end of the webinar. But one of the things that I did want to address is one of the questions was whether or not we could share the list of the great themes that Jocelyn just shared. So if she can remember, document all of those really great topics or areas that she just shared with the group, we'll certainly pass those along if it's available. Lisa, do you have anything to expand on what Brooke shared?
Yeah, I definitely think as well that the takeaway, additional takeaway should be is the focusing on the policies, the procedure, and the process. And if one were to do that, it really requires you to engage all the key stakeholders. Again, I want to reiterate students and also student groups, and looking at your LGBTQ student groups and your security and your local police to engage them on what policy works best on your campus. What may work in Philadelphia may not work in Vermont. And so you really have to understand your campus and assess by doing campus climate assessments or surveys, which I have found in the last 10 years to be helpful, because sometimes you write policies that you believe will work when in fact it's not going to be effective for that population.
And just to add to, so totally agreeing with what Lisa is saying, and making sure that the policies are centralized and easy to find. So if we have these great policies that have been informed by multiple voices across campus, but if students can't access them or find them, they don't do us any good. And so making sure that you have like one location where everything is housed, and so a student can go there and find information about what the police procedure looks like, what the conduct procedure looks like. But again, so not only that they're in writing, but that they are accessible for students and they know where to find them.
And I think that process also, you know, whether you're drafting a policy or whether you're trying to create a resource that outlines these rights and options, it does also cause the campus to have to take a step back and consider what does that look like regarding, you know, when we're considering all of the different touch points and all the different areas where someone might come forward and they might disclose, do we have a process where we understand what the role of each office is, what they're capable or able to do, and how they can best support students within our campus community? And how are we communicating that in a way that they can not only understand, but as you were just saying, Brooke, in a way that they can actually access? So all of these are really excellent points. So some of the takeaways that we have from that is really looking again at that multidisciplinary approach, recognizing that educating your campus before, during, and after the development of policies is key. So making sure that they know where to access them, that they're involved as much as possible in developing them, and certainly that you're revisiting them, just as we saw Brooke talking about a little bit earlier, whether it's through debriefs or your working group, to make sure that whatever you put together in a policy is actually working in practice, and making sure that they're clear and that you have a centralized approach for sharing the information.
Could I add one thing to that, if you don't mind?
Oh, please do.
Yes, I just want to kind of reiterate what Brooke was saying as well, in terms of your institution's website should be integrated in the compliance efforts, meaning in essence that you should have a two-click rule. Your students should be able to go to your website and in 2 clicks know what's the name, the title, the contact information for the Title IX coordinator, your policy. They shouldn't have to look around your website. So it's key to tie your website into compliance.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks so much to not only, you know, knowing what your system is, but knowing where people access information, because a lot of times we could spend a lot of time crafting policies or crafting these documents, but if people can't access them, then unfortunately we're certainly not reaching our students or our campus community in the way that we would like to. So really excellent insight there. Well, before we move on to questions, we wanted to just wrap up this part of the conversation with really talking about concrete things. So if you're thinking about what is one program or concrete thing a practitioner could do or start on their campus right now, what are some of the kind of ideas that you could lend to any of the folks that are listening or participating in this webinar?
So I'm happy to provide a couple. So for those of you listening to the webinar, this is my primary work that I'm doing day to day, is actually on campus doing the programming and working with students. And so I can give a couple concrete examples that might be helpful. So the first tip that I will say is don't be afraid to fail. So this is really challenging work, and sometimes the best prevention programs come out of taking a risk. And so try lots of different things, and 9 out of the 10 might fail, but you might find really good one good program that then is helping to make huge changes on campus. So don't be afraid to fail and try new things. I can't tell you how many times I've had programs just epically fail, and but again, then we find one that is super successful. And so an example of that is we have been really trying to not just talk about gender violence, but talk about the foundational pieces of that. So we know that attitudes and beliefs about gender and about sexuality lead to behaviors that cause gender violence. And so what are some things we can do to address the attitudes, behaviors, values around gender and sexuality? And so we were trying to think about programming or ways that we could address the healthy relationships and kind of communication piece around sex and sexuality on campus. And we piloted a couple years ago. They're called Sexy Hour workshops. Our peer education education group facilitates them, and they are these workshops that teach people how to figure out their values and boundaries around sex, and then how to communicate those to partners. And the pilot went amazing, and so now they are offered twice a month on a particular topic. We're partnering with other organizations on campus around them. There is a buzz around campus, so first-year students, well, we heard about these sexy hour workshops, like when are they being offered? But again, a risk, something that we tried, and it worked really successfully. So.
And this is Jocelyn, if I may just jump in here. To the extent that we recognize that there's a link between alcohol and drug abuse and sexual violence, I strongly believe that there has to be continuing education and programming around the kinds of prevention strategies that target at-risk student populations such as Greeks, student athletes, and also to empower the bystander. And that would be one of the first things that I would attempt to implement.
It's really kind of building on your existing programs and making sure that programs aren't just kind of targeted or specific to one area, that there are other folks on campus that that certainly would benefit from these programs. Lisa, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to questions?
Yeah, I would strongly recommend train, educate. It's very critical. You need to, we do something unique, and this is something that I've been doing, again, for the last 10 years, is integrating the compliance training and awareness about sexual assault and sexual misconduct in the student orientation. You need to be able to educate a potential person that could be victimized at your campus. You also have to have manager training. Managers need to be aware of their responsibilities as a supervisor, what the legal ramifications are if they are not in compliance, and how they put an institution at risk. And I would also recommend that everyone began to look at what the President Obama put out in April, the first report of the White House Task Force to Protect Students from Sexual Assault, because it gives a detailed 52-point guidance to all of us on where our campuses should be at in the next year to 2 years. It looks at how we're going to be mandated to conduct campus climate surveys by 2016. And also another thing that I really engage myself into looking into is preventing sexual assaults and engaging men. And we do like a brown bag lunch with our male and female students on consent, on and other avenues, so that they are aware of how not to place themselves in situations that can harm them. So I would add those points, that I would suggest everyone go and look at the President's guidance and just kind of evaluate where you are in that 52-point directive. I know it seems like a lot, but it really comes straight from the Dear Colleague. But the Dear Colleague letter from April 4th, 2011 to now, when this policy guideline came out, there have been a lot of changes. And so I would highly recommend, if you want to track those changes, that you go to the Center for Excellence in Higher Education Law and Policy, and you can track the changes from the April 4th, 2011 Dear Colleague to the changes made now in April, that the President made in April 2014.
And
can I just add one more quick comment?
Absolutely.
So I think two really great points of entry that were just mentioned. So the bystander and then the first year orientation. And so, right, like those are great places to start. And then make sure that you're bridging the literature on how gender violence specifically works in those areas, and then your campus specifically. So for example, we know, bystander intervention works really well for alcohol, for hazing. There's a different piece though with gender violence. violence. And so we know that even if they have bystander skills, not likely to intervene if they don't have attitudes and beliefs and values that non-consensual sex is a problem. And similar with orientation, you know, there is studies and research that shows if we do a great orientation program, they're so overwhelmed with emotional anxiety from being first years on campus, they need some type of follow-up. So make sure that you're bridging the literature on orientation programming and bystander programs with the gender violence literature so that you really are creating something that is going to be effective and work on your campus in particular. So you don't want to put all of the time and energy and funding and resources into things. You know, so make sure that you're doing that behind the scenes work to apply those things specifically to gender violence and then to the needs of your campus.
And Brooke, this is Jocelyn. I just wanted to say quickly, and this is the value of having ongoing either online training to complement and support that kind of one-on-one face-to-face training.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways you can do that, and I'm so glad that Not Alone was brought into this, because one of the questions that came in was whether anyone had climate surveys or if they could suggest a source for some good ones. So that website has a lot of really great information, like a sample climate survey and like information on prevention education. So moving away from just risk reduction and also looking at bystander intervention and considering the attitudes and behaviors that Brooke was just talking about. And really building a culture and working to build a culture in which the entire campus community is engaged in this, that we're going beyond just, you know, trying to prevent victimization from one person feeling as though they need to protect themselves, to really looking at how do all of us play a role if we're seeing things that could be unsafe within our campus culture. How do we feel empowered to address it? And, you know, as Brooke was saying, there's we're not going to be able to do that unless we take a look at some of the attitudes that shape that then shape their behaviors. So notalone.gov has some great resources related to prevention, related to climate surveys. We also mentioned building on existing programs, so starting to think about what do we already have in place, what type of information are we already sharing, and do we need to expand that to really make sure that we're addressing all of the different individuals on our campus. Thank you so much for the individual who shared about how it's important not to lose sight of male victims, because that is certainly something to consider as well, that a lot of times we do fall into using the language of the woman as being the victim or the survivor, but we know that victimization unfortunately can happen to anyone within our campus community. And we also need to consider not just how we educate students, but how we educate employees as well. So certainly really looking at something that's inclusive of all of people's different experiences, gender, and a number of different other areas. So thank you for that reminder, because it's a really good point. And then, as Brooke was saying, even creating a workshop and piloting it. So recognizing that everything doesn't have to be perfect at first, and that evaluation can also play a role in that. As we mentioned, we'll have a webinar on October 2nd that will dive a little bit more into that, more specifically as to what might we consider and how do we evaluate some of these efforts to make sure that we're not only just putting the energy into creating them, that they're actually making a difference. So we have a few more minutes, about 12 more minutes, so we just wanted to make sure that we left some time for questions, and we had quite a few of great questions coming in. And one that I saw come through was really talking about what about if you have all of the different elements that you talked about, because you talked about really bringing a team together of people, many of you talked about bringing a team together of dedicated individuals to really make sure that your policies and your procedures are a good fit for your institution. So what if you have all of those different elements in place in theory, but they're not collaborative? So you have the boxes checked, but it's not necessarily translating into a collaborative effort. Does anyone have any ideas for if the system really isn't working as it was intended?
This is Lisa. I do have some recommendations. If the campus has a Title IX coordinator, one of the roles of that individual should be meeting and bringing all of those folks together, and also making sure that you are connected to the threat assessment team, to your law enforcement or security personnel on campus. And so I think it's pivotal for the Title IX coordinator to be sort of the conductor for the process. And that person can also get the buy-in, because more than likely they're going to have direct access to the president or the CEO of the institution, and the resources are important at that point. And so the Title IX coordinator has to be the person that says, I need the resources, I need to provide training, and also brings the team together.
And so
This
it
is
sounds like,
Jocelyn.
I just wanted to expand, so it sounds like the takeaway from that is finding someone who can certainly get the buy-in, not just from the folks on the team, but certainly we know that there needs to be kind of a top-down, bottom-up approach. So how do you make sure that you do have somebody who has the buy-in and has the ear of president and other folks on the campus? Did you have something to expand to that?
So I was just going to add, and so mine is actually the opposite. It is the bottom up approach. But so, and this may sound cheesy to some of you, but literally doing like a half-day retreat and getting everyone in the room and just getting out there on the table, like what isn't working and why. And so, right, like if people are able to say like it's a personality thing, or it's a policy procedure thing. So really just getting out there, like what is getting in the way, and then giving people the opportunity of, right, so where can you compromise, or where can you find areas that you can change and work on to create that collaboration. So almost that like 5 dysfunctions of a team model, where you really get everyone together, you create that trust, and then you let people openly and frankly talk about what isn't working so that you can find out what you need to fix in order to move forward.
And this
So
is
having
Jocelyn.
that honest conversation. And Brooke, you had mentioned a little bit earlier about the importance of everyone kind of understanding their roles and where that fits in. Did you find that anything, with your own process, that all of you were able to have some of those honest conversations to really figure out how do we work together as a team, and know that it's kind of a safe environment to be able to talk frankly and honestly, because we know that that can be a challenge within any environment, and certainly within higher education?
Yeah, that is certainly what makes ours work. So again, the recognition that we don't all have to agree. We come from different fields and different lenses and viewpoints, and we don't have to agree. We just have to be able to come together and work together. And so that really has made the collaborative process so much more easier for us. And again, we did have to, a couple years ago, we had a one-day retreat, and it was everyone, get it out now, because like we need to find ways to move forward. And what came out of that retreat was the recognition that we have different roles and different approaches, and that's okay. We don't have to agree. We just have to be able to work together.
And this is Jocelyn. I will add that if all that fails, then the next step that I would recommend is that this is where your president, your CEO, actually makes it mandatory, so that, and it could be incorporated in the principal's evaluations, annual evaluations, but this is a last resort. You clearly don't want to start with this. But if everything else fails, then I think this is where you go, where the president or the provost actually sends an email or some communication out to the university campus, reinforcing that this is for the well-being. It's in the best interest of the university and the well-being of students, faculty, and staff, the entire community, so that importance, at least the importance of this kind of education and programming, is at least seen on paper coming from the top. But that would be a last resort, again, as I said.
Sure, absolutely. And we actually also had a similar question to that, is when law enforcement on a campus is doing the bulk of Clery, in this case they were talking specifically to Clery related work, and there's not currently a group of stakeholders, what are suggestions for other entities who want to create a team around this work, suggestions specific to approaching PD about this? So first thing I want to say is it's fantastic there are other folks that want to get engaged in that element and kind of recognize the importance. Do any of you have any suggestions for that?
So it depends, I think, on what type of police department you're working with. So if it's a local community one versus like a campus police department. So similar to Jocelyn's point, if it's a campus police department, that's something that senior leadership can certainly help with. So for example, our police department reports to the vice provost and finance department, and so their supervisor can say, like, you have to work with the rest of campus. If it's a community police department or a local police department, that's a little different. And so one of the things that might be helpful in that situation is identifying someone on campus. So for us, it would be our general counsel's office, who really could help to be that liaison mediator between the legal police side and then the campus university administration side, because they have a foot in both of those roles. So again, if there's an office or an individual on campus who can kind of help be that liaison person, that might be a good place to start.
And I think a lot of times too, I think it's another area where we can re-examine some of the assumptions, because we'll also sometimes get calls, like I mentioned, where people feel as though all of a certain element like clear compliance has to fall on them, and not recognizing that there are individuals within other departments that want to help and feel as though they could really play a significant role in helping with some of those areas. So sometimes it might be considering whether the assumption that you have is true. And if it is true, and if that is the case, maybe looking at how do we kind of get the buy-in or the influence from another area. It also relates to another question that we had come in, which is, what does this mean for the campus Clery coordinator, and where do they fit in? Many of these coordinators are not driving these discussions, policies, procedures, and training. How can they manage up? So I think that kind of relates back to all that's been shared over the past couple of minutes, which is really looking at, where do you have the buy-in? Do you have the kind of authority to bring this team together? If you don't, who does? So who might you kind of work with more carefully in order to make that happen? And to see if there's kind of an overlap. So, it was mentioned a little bit earlier about a Title IX team. So there may be other areas of the campus where you have some of these key players and individuals who are already working as a team. So how might you tap into some of the existing structures, recognize where there's some overlap between the laws, and really kind of bring all of that together. Our organization has a collaborative program that requires teams to really work together to engage in ongoing online and in-person training, to do a self-assessment. So sometimes it's a matter of getting the structure in place in order to get that ongoing buy-in. So thank you. A lot of that feedback was really helpful. One of the things that was shared was, as someone who works at a rape crisis center, how can I build better relationships with the victim advocates on campus without them feeling like I'm going to step on their toes?
This is Jocelyn, and I can share our own personal experience, which we actually, our community rape crisis intervention counselor, which is a separate and private entity. We have engaged the counselors to visit our university at least, I think it's on Wednesdays, 1 day per week, and students have been informed about that in the event that there's any kind of violence, sexual or otherwise, that they do not feel comfortable reporting to the university campus counselors, that they may avail themselves of these services that are provided by the community crisis center. So again, just getting them involved and having them on campus and having them being very visible, that if students feel, and oftentimes students feel a lot more comfortable going to someone in the community who happens to be on the campus rather than coming to one of our counselors.
We do the same thing on our campus. So at Lehigh, the local Rape Crisis Center Crime Victims Council of the Lehigh Valley, they're on campus at all of our events, and they do trainings for us. And for the person who asked the question, again, that ally approach, I have never turned down an offer from someone else to say, hey, can we help you with this? And so reaching out to local colleges and universities and saying, we're available to be at events, or we're available to do trainings, like, are you in need of any help with that? Could be a great way to start the conversation. again, as people on campus who are doing this work, from my perspective, there is never enough help you can get. And so having someone from the local community offer that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, part of that may also just be acknowledging and recognizing, their expertise, because I know that sometimes that can be the concern, with outside organizations trying to work with folks at the institution. Sometimes it can be a matter of realizing that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but rather expand the options that are available to survivors. So I love that idea of really approaching it as an ally. Did anyone want to expand on that? Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up the webinar, but did anyone of our panelists want to expand on that before we move on?
Yeah, I had one comment. I would also suggest to the participants to use their district attorney's office in their county or area, because they always have victim advocate personnel that work for them and counselors. And what I found is they love to come out to college campuses and provide training. And when we have an investigation, they always bring to our campus. We open the door for them to conduct their investigations on campus, so that you build that relationship and have a continuous collaborative relationship even with your district attorney's office.
Right, so kind of seeing how other people might play a role in doing that. Well, our time is up for today, but we really want to thank again to Campus Answers for sponsoring this webinar. You can learn a little bit more about Campus Answers on the slide in front of you, and to all of today's panelists. As a reminder, in your chat panel, you'll see a link to an evaluation for today's webinar. So many of you have given us such great feedback and things for us to think about for moving forward for our webinars this month and also throughout the year, so we appreciate that. We'd appreciate if you take a few short minutes just to share your own thoughts and feedback. We'd love to know what content you'd like to see more of as we plan additional webinars. This webinar was just one of 7 that the Clery Center has organized for National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So you can visit our website at www.clerycenter.org to register for upcoming webinars, and you'll also be able to access the recordings of past webinars. And you can sign up to receive weekly professional development emails during National Campus Safety Awareness Month. So if you have not joined us for that already, you can find that info by visiting the Education tab on our homepage and clicking on NACSAM, National Campus Safety Awareness Month 2014. And we also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the Clery Center handle for daily campus safety information. As I mentioned, this webinar was recorded, so that recording will be shared online and will be emailed to you within 48 hours. And we'll also reach out to Jocelyn. I know that you had mentioned a couple of really great points that that participants were looking to see if we could reiterate. So I'll reach out to you and see if we can share some of that information. If you have any questions following up, please feel free to reach out to us. Our email address is info@clerycenter.org. And thank you so much for joining us all today. Thank you again to our panelists, and we hope you all have a really great afternoon.